Hello, my name's Mark Vernon, and I wanted to see whether I could offer something to the conversation that's going on between figures like Jordan Peterson, Ken Wilber, John Vervaeke, the people at Rebel Wisdom, and others are trying to put this conversation together. And what I wanted to see if I could do was inject the perspective of a figure who I feel and kind of hope will become seminal in this debate and discussion, which is the figure of Owen Barfield. He was one of the Inklings, friend of Alan Watts, and he always thought his time would come. And I feel with this conversation that's going on now, maybe his time is coming, and I'm going to try and make his case. So I thought I'd try in this half hour or so just to see whether I could put together some sense of what he has got to offer, how he's in the conversation but also offering something different, and see whether that can make any sense. And I've structured it around three sort of broad areas that pick up on themes that repeatedly come up when people discuss Peterson, Wilber, Vervaeke, and others, and see whether Barfield does have something different to say. So the first one I wanted to talk about was what you might call the problems with the kind of mountaintop view. I feel often what the approach, often from cognitive science, in fact, tries to do is kind of take a mountaintop view and come out with a kind of theory of everything, a map of meaning, maybe a cognitive schema, sort of developmental schema, and integrate everything that's empirically observed about people's development into that map, in order that where people are at can be charted. Now, there's clearly something very valuable in this. I'm a psychotherapist, and developmental psychology is very influential and important in trying to help someone. But it does lead to problems as well. And it's actually quite often commented that people can get kind of lost in the maps, by which I think they mean that they kind of lose touch with reality as it is, trying to chart where they are on the map, or there's endless debate about the maps themselves, rather than the reality of what's going on that the maps are trying to open up. And Barfield has a very different approach, which I feel can complement that and maybe help reconnect with reality when the maps approach tends to disconnect. And that's because he took a narrative approach to these questions, and in particular he took a narrative approach that stressed a kind of imaginative participation with oneself and with life. Now let me just try and explain what I mean by that. Is that he was a philologist, and he looked at how words change meaning across different periods of cultural time, so the way that ancient Greeks used words, late antiquity, the medieval period, the early modern, even differences between the early modern and modernity as we know it now. Words have very dramatically changed meaning, and because words are, we participate in life by the use of words. Words aren't just signs that we use to point, but words themselves carry a life, a kind of vitality. You wouldn't be able to make any sense of what I'm trying to say unless those words directly and not just conveyed, but were immersed in the meaning of what we're talking about, what I'm trying to say. They are in a way life themselves. Barfield put it this way. He said that words have soul. They have a kind of animating quality. And so the advantage of looking at approaching things from a philological perspective is that you always stay in touch with that vitality, with that life. And what Barfield did was tell a story about how words change meaning, which was based on the idea that consciousness itself changes, that it evolves, that it shifts. And the experience of life that someone in the ancient world, for example, would have had is therefore very different from the experience of life which we have now. But it's always about the experience of life. And it tells, say, the stories of the ancient myths to open up that older experience and see what's been lost, what's been gained from the kind of myths which we tell ourselves now, the kind of heuristics that we use now. It's imaginative too, because language is this intermediate form which we humans use. It's part of what Plato called our in-between status. As it were, we're not just like other animals, so far as we can tell, who, as it were, just get on with life. we do reflect on life, and we have this capacity to step back to some degree, and that forms part of our life as well, whether it be out of wonder or out of anxiety. But neither we like the gods, who don't use language. All the kind of visions of heaven and so on interestingly show paradise as a place where language isn't used, but instead a kind of direct communication goes on, a kind of telepathy. It's as almost the experience there can be tolerated and known in all its fullness. We aren't there yet. But language is this intermediate kind of zone. Put it another way, it's both sound, a physical thing, and its meaning, what you might call a spiritual thing, something that's immaterial. So we human beings, our life, as it were, is very connected to our use of language. Not because language determines everything that we can know and experience, but because language is of the domain that we're predominantly in, this in-between status, kind of aware but not fully transparent to being itself. So this philological approach, this use of words that have soul, meant that he could track how meanings changed, and so words can also become sort of fossils of consciousness. They can tell this story of how things change. I was thinking about a word this morning which captures something of this, the word emotion. And until really quite recently, until the 19th century, the word emotion was still very connected to motion. Emotion and motion were sort of one and the same thing. Emotion just meant a kind of agitation that led to motion. So, for example, romantic poets could talk about the sweet emotion of the wind, that particularly the south wind was felt to carry a kind of sweetness, and that was part of its motion. The emotion of the wind was in the world, you might say. And it was only in the 19th century, when the disenchantment of the world really set in, that emotion was taken into ourselves and is now experienced predominantly, if not only, as a kind of inner state. So emotion, the word, is both a fossil and older consciousness, which you can pick up in poets like, say, Shelley, that talk about the emotion of the wind, as well as carrying something about our inner state now. If I say emotion now, you experience something of what it is to have that inner state, which I also have. So it's a kind of narrative, a sort of philological approach that keeps you in touch with reality and experience, rather than a schema, which for all its uses inevitably has to kind of detach you somewhat from the experience. And so people often talk about getting lost in the maps, or having endless debates about the maps, and losing touch with reality itself. So that was one thing that's an advantage, I think, with this kind of narrative approach. Another advantage of the narrative approach is that it extends the sort of epistemological range of things. So, for example, it's often remarked, T.S. Eliot, the poet, remarked this, that science is very good at gathering information, but you need a kind of knowledge in order to know how to join that information up. You need a kind of wisdom in order to be wise about the different kinds of knowledge approaches you might take to that pure information. So you need to, as it were, to join the dots, but then there's also a question of how you join the dots. That's wisdom. But this participative approach, which Barfield advocates, takes it further than that, actually, because wisdom is also connected to meaning and purpose. As it were, there is lots of different kinds of wisdom in the world. There's the wisdom of the moment, there's the wisdom of different spiritual traditions, different wisdom traditions they're sometimes called. And you can sort, as it were, between those different wisdoms by asking this question of meaning and purpose. That is a felt sense of what draws you in life and makes life feel fuller. And that itself can discern the wisdom. But it doesn't stop there. And with meaning and purpose, there's needed for a kind of vision as well. It's not just the individual meaning and purpose that counts, but the vision which can be shared in a collective sense too. That, as it were, discerns the meaning and purpose. What vision you have. And then vision itself, as it were, sits within being. The way the world actually is, reality itself. So reality, you might say, gives rise to different kinds of vision, which gives rise to different kinds of meaning and purpose, which gives rise to multiple wisdoms, different takes on the world, which can join the dots of knowledge, which itself can understand, can see the different knots of pure information. So you move from not just, as it were, information to knowledge to wisdom, as the sciences, particularly the cognitive sciences, try to do, but extend that even further. So you join that into meaning and purpose, vision, and then being itself. So it links up the whole of reality, this approach, I think, through these different levels of being. That sounds a bit complicated perhaps, but it's in a story. When you read a story and when you read a myth, actually all these levels are operative. And again, this is kind of narrative approach. You read a modern novel and you realise that it's not just, as it were, the information of what's going on in the plot, the knowledge and the wisdom of the characters concerned, the meaning and vision of their life, but what their life itself conveys. Being itself is operative. It happens at all these different levels when you try and deploy a narrative or a myth to navigate your way through life, and not just a schema. So to put it another way, this is about sort of participating all the way in life. It's about your love of life, your zest of life. It brings in desire as well as cognition and awareness. I think it's also quite one with the age. For all the faults of our age, if there is one powerful force operative, it is desire. We want more out of life. I think that the genius of capitalism is that it takes that more, it completely understands it, but drives it into pure desire for material gain, for what you might call the material more, and tends to occlude or to conceal spiritual goods, which operate according to different laws than the material world. But nonetheless, our age is threaded through and through with this desire for more. And I think that you always get into problems if you try to be too ascetic about that, if you're seen to be resisting the age. Because what happens then is that life in all its fullness reduces to a kind of set of moral demands. It starts to feel heavy and oppressive. But again, all the great spiritual teachers have talked about how life actually feels like it's expansive, it lightens, it grows, your desire is satisfied when you're following the right way. And I think we get a sort of clue to that from Barfield's sense that participation is what counts. You can ask yourself, is this approach inviting me to participate in life more fully in all the ways that I have? It certainly is about discipline and training and focus, but ultimately it's about opening up. And so I very much like this alternative approach as well for that reason. And then finally, a sort of comment in this first section about narrative rather than map. I think what it also does is it joins up what's known with the knower. It no longer leaves you a sort of stranger in the world, but because it operates at this level of soul, cultivates a sense of participating in life. And again, the more cognitive approaches, they inevitably separate what's known with the knower, you, from what you're studying. In order to do the study, they obviously want to return you to life and reality itself. But that comes about quite spontaneously when you are, for example, engaged in poetry. Barfield was very interested in poetry, because a poetic utterance doesn't just tell you something about the world, but gives you a feeling for that about the world as well. When Shakespeare compares the beloved to a summer's day, he's not just saying this is my beloved, but he's conveying something of the felt experience of being with that beloved. So what's known and the knower join up in this soulful way. And I think that it's the reason why soul is such an important word in this debate as well. Ask yourself, is what I'm thinking about, reading about, talking about, the conversation, does it feel it has this quality of soul? Because the point about soul is that with soul you don't feel a stranger in the world, you feel you belong, you feel you're being carried along by the kind of flow of life which wants you, but if, as it were, wants you to be part of this bigger flow as well. I think there's no coincidence that jazz is often called soul music, because jazz requires both the participant to know something about the music, whether they're a listener and certainly if they're a player, but they can't do jazz unless they're also completely immersed in the music. That what they know and what they're knowing must be completely connected, and soul is the natural word that brings those side of things together. So that's the first sort of take on these things which I think Barfield has. It's a participative approach. that uses a kind of narrative of who we are as human beings, very interested in language, very interested in soul, and so can both be a kind of understanding, but an understanding that constantly invites you to keep a main focus on reality itself, and not get lost in the abstractions from reality. First point. The second area I wanted to pick up was how Barfield talks not so much about developmental stages, as if there's a kind of linear or cyclical spiral sort of progression through our psychology, but instead his bigger story is one of return. He sees our task as being a return to a kind of spiritual fullness, which was our aboriginal state, but it's a return with a key difference. So he actually sees it as a kind of U, rather than say an upwards slope or as a spiral upwards. His preferred shape is a U, and what he argues is that individually in life, maybe even through the course of a day, we are both descending down one side of the U, but also have the potential to reascend up the other side of the U. And he thinks that if that happens to us as individuals, it also happens to cultures, and indeed the unfolding of history over periods of time. There's a descent and then an ascent. And what that descent and ascent signifies is the descent from the kind of aboriginal whole, the one, to use the Neo-Platonic scheme, a word, maybe Brahman, the divine, God, a kind of spiritual connection and integration, perhaps that you see in Aboriginal cultures, where there's not really a distinctive difference between, say, the me and the not me, the mortal and the immortal, the self and the other, the creature and other creatures. There's a kind of continual flow and negotiation of that sense of life. But human beings seem to descend, and this leads to both kind of alienation, on the one hand, a sense of disconnect and struggle, but also a defining of the individual, the creation of inner life. That makes us who we are as people, as persons. It gives us self-awareness. It gives us a sort of sense of awakening up to who we are, for all that is painful. Our self, you might say, is born out of a kind of ontological gap that opens up between us and the rest of the world. And then the task, as it were, is to return to that sense of union, but without loss of the individual, without loss of self. To use it in Neoplatonic terms, it's the idea that the many can join back into the one, but with their particularity completely participating in the one, rather than say their individuality being kind of lost in order to return to the one. It's the vision you get, say, in Dante. When Dante goes into paradise, he constantly remarks how all the souls in paradise are distinct souls. He still meets individuals he knew back on earth, but those souls are all moving in their own place, in their own way, in a kind of marvellous harmony that is the music of paradise. They're the many individuals now differentiated, but also fully participating and enjoying the life of the one, the life of God. So this U shape is Barfield's preferred sort of metaphor for trying to capture how he sees our movement through life, both as individuals and as cultures. And I think it has certain kind of advantages. I've partly hinted at one there already, which is that the ego, rather than being seen as a kind of problem, is actually seen, well, to use a Buddhist phrase, as the obstacle that's also the way. That when the ego, first of all, differentiates, it steps back, as it were, from life. It can become inflated, it can become vainglorious, the risks that we know with ego. But the way to deal with that is not to try and smash the ego, but is to see that the ego can become the vehicle by which you can return to the one. To use Jung's phrase, it must become the servant and not the master. The ego must realise that it's just the tip of the iceberg of the bigger self, of the divine self ultimately. But the advantages it has is it can reflect, it can discern, it can know that of which it's participating in. And so this reorientation, this realignment of the ego is in fact the return back to the one. It's a constant sort of struggle, constant process, pride, vainglory, all these kind of things which have been identified in the wisdom traditions constantly come up, and yet it's working through that that you return to the one. And a second advantage I think that the Barfield approach has is it's both a process of emanation and a process of emergence. Sometimes in these debates, this conversation, there's a kind of a discussion about whether it's about emanation or about emergence. So emanation broadly is a sense of descent. It's the sense that maybe from the one, the many, creation, evolution emerged, and as it were, distance itself from the one. That sort of movement outwards of the emanation. And then the alternative is emergence, which is from something very simple, say the Big Bang, came a gradual complexification of creation, and it passes through a series of thresholds, and as a threshold is moved through, something new emerges that couldn't really have been anticipated before. The most obvious case is the emergence of life out of non-life. Now, they both have their kind of advantage, but I think that they can be joined together with this sense of descent and return, because, say, on the up movement, something new is experienced, as it were, from the individual's point of view. Something new does seem to emerge, but also at the same time, it's seen to be actually a kind of return from what originally emanated, if a return with difference. So there's a way in which these two sides of the discussion could be brought together, I think, with this you experience that Barfield articulated. I think we're beginning to see this take even in new Darwinian evolution, new accounts of Darwinian evolution, even in the science itself. I'm thinking here of the work of individuals like Dennis Noble or Simon Conway Morris, and what they're beginning to realise and put the case together for is that an evolutionary story which is seen as just pure randomness can't really account for the way that we see things are, because it does seem that there's direction. If I say the word purpose, I mean maybe sort of goal-endedness in science. Science is very nervous about purpose, strictly speaking, so I don't want you just to sort of load purpose and teleology back into science. But certainly someone like Dennis Noble is starting to see how the mutations that occur in organisms at various levels of the organism, from the DNA right up to the whole organism, they often seem to have they cut short just what would have been a purely random process. To rather simplify it, you might say there's not enough time in the history of the universe for all that evolutionary unfolding if it was just purely random. There does seem to be some sense of rule, or to use Simon Conway Morris's term, there's a kind of convergence in evolution. That evolution, what Simon Conway Morris suggests is that evolution searches out niches, and niches are parts of the environment that are pre-existing to the organism, and that the organism, through its evolution, fills those niches, and so evolution seems to converge into the same answers. So an often cited example of that is the eye, that we have binocular eyes, like octopuses have binocular eyes, and yet our eyes and octopus eyes have evolved by completely different evolutionary pathways, but they occupy the same niche of binocular sight in the environment, in the cosmos. Now, there's debate amongst evolutionists about whether niches are created or whether they're discovered. Simon Conway Morris is on the side of discovery. But if that plays out, if that wins out, that idea about niches, much also like Dennis Noble's ideas about there seeming to be a direction at all sorts of different levels of reality too, then I think that's going to start to fit with evolution used in the more spiritual sense, where levels of emergence are actually seen as a return to the one, because the emergence fills niches that are actually contained within the whole. You might put it in that way. That would be a kind of spiritual way of trying to knit Darwinian evolution with spiritual evolution. So that's another value, I think, of this idea of a kind of return rather than a developmental process. Another advantage it has, I think, that the return notion really values older kind of consciousnesses, earlier stages of what developmentalism would call developmental stages, developmental phases. And it's because older stages are seen to have a clue, a kind of imaginative sense of where the return must go, if it's a return, even though it's a return with kind of self-awareness. So, for example, an older phase of consciousness would have been what Barfield calls original participation. It was this sense when there wasn't a clear difference between me and not me, mortal, immortal, self, other, gods, humans, this older sense of flow that I was describing earlier. But rather than seeing that as sort of primitive or something somehow to be, as it were, moved on from, it's actually got an completely vital clue to us about how we might live again, because we too want to know that sense of connection. We too want to know and see not just ourselves but others, not just mortal life but immortal life. To know, as it were, of the life of nature and the world around us, to feel it, to participate in it. As our ancestors had, according to this story. But we want to do it with this difference of self-awareness. We want to do it with this sense of individuality that's porous once more to the world around us. So older consciousnesses are not seen as stages to move on from. They're seen as actually vital to study and get to know, even to preserve, because they have completely important clues, imaginative nudges, which we must learn about in order to ourselves be on this path of return. You get this when someone like Jung, for example, or more recently in anthropology, they study these other forms of life, these other consciousnesses. It's even now happening in the study of plants, trees and fungi under the ground and so on. And what you get from these studies is not just a kind of objective stepping back of, oh, this is how it works, but it evokes wonder and awe in you. There's this sense that there's a different consciousness as well just beneath your feet. And that itself, because it carries this quality of soul, can awaken a kind of consciousness in you over time too. So science becomes a spiritual practice. Anthropology becomes a spiritual awakening. What was old needs to be taken into what's going to be new. So there's not a division, not again this sort of linear sense of moving on, not a sense of superiority, but of a gathering and a return, which this U-shaped model of participation can offer. Just a final thought on this second phase, which I think the second aspect that perhaps Barfield can offer. It changes the language around our times. So rather than seeing our times as a kind of meta-crisis, as a kind of complexification of things that's never been seen before, what it sees it as is a kind of fall, as a crisis, but within that crisis there's good and there's bad. Again, Barfield's philology would know that crisis wasn't just a bad notion originally, but it was also a turning point. And so too, our crisis now can be a turning point. And it's the turning point that's at the bottom of the U. That's where this fits into the second observation of Barfield's contribution to the conversation. That the crisis is a turning point. And much like, say, the fall in Judeo-Christian mythology, well, certainly in Christian mythology, the fall is, as it were, where Adam and Eve kind of wake up and realise their alienation. Nonetheless, it's also the moment when salvation becomes possible, to use the Christian term, that's also the beginning of their return. And so Jesus, for example, in the story is called the second Adam. The original fall is seen as also the moment of possible awakening. Sometimes it's said, actually, in psychotherapy that our sense of ontological gap, our sense of crisis, our sense of anxiety, is also actually the moment when our sense of selfhood can start to form. That'd be a psychotherapeutic way of putting it. Anyway, so it's not, as it were, that we're just looking over the edge and sort of hoping that somehow we might pull out of it, maybe through better technology, through becoming smarter, somehow sort of bootstrapping ourselves out of this crisis. This more spiritual you story, which Barfield has to offer, sees the seeds of a new emergence within the crisis, because the crisis is also a turning point. It's not to downplay the seriousness of what we face, but it is perhaps also to see that there's hope in the despair, if only we, as it were, can see it aright, can have the right vision, the right way of shaping this story, telling a different narrative, which is one of participation and return. I think Barfield can offer us something that could become very important in that way too. So I've talked about how he doesn't have a kind of mountain view, map view, but a narrative participating view. And I've talked also about how he doesn't have a kind of developmental stages view, but has a U or return point of view, and tried to outline how that can be of use and benefit. A third way in which I think Barfield's different, and in a way this is the sort of most key of all, is that Barfield is utterly ontologically committed about reality. Again, in some of the conversation that goes on, you hear a kind of ontological wariness, or an ontological sort of reserve, holding back, hedging your bets. It particularly comes up in questions about God and the divine. Do you believe in God? Someone might be asked, and someone like Jordan Peterson will, in a way, quite rightly say, well, it depends what you mean, and that is very much a good response. It's called apophatic theology in the tradition, the awareness that you can't say anything positively about God, so it's hard to affirm anything positively about God. But nonetheless, within apophaticism, there's no doubt that being itself is the basis of reality, that the divine is the basis of reality. And from that, that's important not just sort of theologically, it's important because that also is the soil of a kind of spiritual ecology, a kind of consciousness that's not just inside our own heads, but that is, as Barfield put it, the inside of the whole world. He's talked about, in terms of beings like angels and spirits, sometimes it's remarked that, if the cosmos seems to have a kind of intelligence, then maybe there are intelligences operative in the cosmos. If I said I had intelligence, you'd assumed there was a kind of intelligence in me. I was an intelligent person, not just a kind of abstract intelligence like a mathematical formula. And so Barfield would say, within this spiritual ecology, we can start to wake up to the inside of the whole world, which will include the sense of other beings, other intelligences that are operative. And this is so important because, not just to make a kind of theological statement, but because it's when we're reconnected, are participating with those other intelligences, with the consciousness that's not just locked inside our skulls, but we realise what's going on inside our skulls is but an echo of the consciousness of the whole cosmos, that the meaning crisis will be over. That we'll be able to have the real basis for forming right relationships with the world around us, whether that be the environment or nature, whether it be spiritual reality too. So ontological commitment is not just a sort of wise hedging of your bets, whether that be for reasons of skepticism or awareness that epistemologically it's very hard to say anything about the divine positively. Actually, at the end of the day, it does matter, because it's whether you have a growing awareness that this spiritual reality more broadly is out there, and that participating with it is actually the path to return. So let me put that in a slightly different way. In terms of the feel of the discussion, it makes a difference too, because, let me use another metaphor that Barfield used. He talked about how modern consciousness has a bit of a camera feel. And what he meant by that was that it can feel a bit like taking a picture with a camera. As it were, there's a kind of black box that reaches out and then tries to grab a bit of reality. But where, as it were, the black box actually is in relation to reality is left sort of in suspense. And science is broadly quite like that, that it, as it were, tries to take the view from nowhere, as Thomas Nagel famously put it, to grab a bit of reality and study it. It's a kind of camera consciousness. But it leaves you with this sense of alienation. So you know something, but you're not quite sure how you as the knower participate with it. And Barfield said that a return consciousness is a different instrument, and the instrument that he returned to was the Aeolian Harp. Now, the Aeolian Harp is a bit like a sort of violin box that has strings tuned over a soundboard, and then it's left in the wind, in, say, a doorway or in a window, so that the wind, the spirit of the earth, Barfield will remember that the word for wind and spirit, pneuma, is the same in all the old languages like Greek and Hebrew. So the idea is that the wind blows over the soundboard and the strings to make the music. It's an instrument that completely participates in the world around it. And he would argue that rather than being cameras, we must start to think of ourselves as Aeolian harps, as it were, tuning ourselves So definitely doing something ourselves, but in order to participate once more with the world around us. And so ask yourself, what's the feel of the conversation? Does the conversation that you're involved with have more of this camera feel, this sense of sort of slight stepping back, or does it have the more Aeolian Harp feel, that as you talk, the music you make is filled with sort of love and passion, and participating with life as a whole, with the inside of the whole world? That's quite a good little indicator of what kind of stance you're taking towards life and what journey you're engaged with. Another area where I think this ontological commitment makes sense is to do with discussions about the shadow. Jung is becoming more important again in this conversation, and his remarks about the shadow are part of that, and working on the shadow, working on the side of yourself that you have constructed a personality around to try and avoid, which we all do, but well, to use the Freudian expression, the repressed always returns, and so the shadow, although we've tried to write it out of our lives, can often be ruling and running our lives. That was the observation which Jung made, but it was just the first observation that Jung made, because Jung also said that through the shadow you can discover the self. And this is again the sort of the spiritual side and ultimately the divine side. And so it's through the shadow. The shadow work, you might say, is not an end in itself. It's a means to a greater end. And that end is a reconnection with the divine. And the reason why the shadow is so important here is because if the shadow is that which you don't want to engage with, it also then becomes a barrier from that which you might engage with more fully. And so I like this idea of ontological commitment, that it doesn't just see our task in life to sort of try and wrestle with ourselves, to be less monstrous, less concerned with our own self and so on, struggling with that. It actually sees the shadow as the route, the way forward into the divine life, into the life of the many that we might share, and then ultimately the many returning to the one. But of course you can only have that sense of the shadow work if you also have that wider ontological sense, that wider ontological commitment too. So there's a second way in which ontological commitments do actually matter. Relatedly, I think you also begin to see that this is not about sort of trying to bootstrap yourself into awakening, to sort of design the right technologies that might lead to the next stage of human evolution, which has this very kind of camera, internal, slightly trapped, caught up, anxious feel. It's about relating. It's about opening up and relating to the world around you. If you have the commitment, the ontological commitment that the world around you is alive with a kind of vitality and a consciousness of its own, whether it be the natural world or whether it be the spiritual world, whether it be the divine world, then you can relate to it. You can speak to it, as it were. You can try and study it, reach out to it, speak to it, but you also begin to expect it to speak back to you. And again, this is actually quite a common experience that many people have, but perhaps the language of relationality can open it up and bring it into this conversation. People talk about synchronicities, they talk about experiences gathered together under parapsychology, they talk about the universe wanted me to do this or didn't want me to do this, even if they're not theists. And of course, if you're theistic, you'll talk about the spirit or about the divine, about Brahman, about the emptiness that's actually a fullness. So what you're trying to do there is learn to relate to these wider aspects of reality, to open up to them. And I think that has a kind of expansive, soulful feel, which the bootstrapping technology, designing our way out of this mess, can lack. Something else that the Barfieldian perspective has to offer. And maybe to bring all this together, I think at the end of the day, what the participative narrative, the you return, the many returning to the one, and the ontological commitment that consciousness is the basis of all things, and that we're trying to see how our consciousness is but a mirror, a reflection, an echo of the wider consciousness that we can relate to. These three aspects of Barfield I've been trying to unpack. The advantage of bringing them all together is that it enables us to be engaged in this conversation as whole people. And by that I mean that we can bring our will to it. We want this return, we want this emergence, we want this sense of evolving and reconnecting, solving the problems that face us, the willful side to us. But it also brings together the desiring part of ourselves, the passion, the love, that sort of energy which can propel us upon the way. It knits it together with will. Will, as it were, if you like, discerns the passion and directs the passion. And then thirdly, it can also bring in the knowledge part of ourselves, the part of us which does actually know things, which is discerned, which is worked out, which can understand the next step at least that we're taking along the way. So the will, the desire and the knowledge can be knitted together, and that's what it is to be a whole person. Those three things gather together in our soulfulness, that as it were, it's not just something lost inside ourselves, but it's engaged with a full flow of life, a full shaping of life. So the conversation between lots of people now, and trying to bring in Barfield's take on it. He was a philologist rather than a cognitive scientist. He thought about language and words and how they carry this soulfulness, that both means we experience life as well as study life in our words. When we use words, we, as it were, feel the meaning as well as hear the meaning. We're the in-between creature, as he put it, awakening and returning to the divine. But with that word, he also then developed, with the study of words, he also developed a narrative, this story of a kind of different experiences of consciousness shaped throughout time. Words are fossils of an older consciousness as well as reflections of our consciousness now. And that understanding that narrative is imaginatively, immensely creative for us now, because older consciousnesses are not just things we've moved on from, but they have their own genius. They enable us to become awakened once more to something which was experienced before, and particularly a participation in life, which is kind of our struggle now. It's a you image of development, and that's completely ontologically committed, not because it knows the divine, let alone all the spiritual reality and so on, but because it senses it's there, and when it speaks to reality, when it tries to study, reach out to reality, it's awake and training itself for those moments when reality speaks back. It learns to hear, you might see, like the Aeolian Harp, with the music that comes out of the wind moving over its strings, as well as to look, which is the more camera consciousness, trying to take sort of snapshots of reality. It brings in, I think, a whole story. Now, if that was of interest, I'll be doing other conversations about this, because I appreciate that I probably didn't capture all of it very clearly, and it's quite a big story to tell. And if I may just make one plug, if you've got this far in the story, in my video, it's this book, which is coming out in August 2019, where I try to tell this story through particularly the Christian consciousness, which is the one that's dominated in the West. That's the reason for picking up on Christianity, but hopefully unpacks a lot of what Barfield has to say. Thanks.